Back in the mid-'80s, I lived in Tampa Bay, Florida. I wasn't married at the time. I worked for a company called Copy Products in Tampa Bay. We sold and serviced Meta copiers. I don't know if they're around or not yet still. But it was a two-person operation to begin with. Alex Martins was the owner and sales manager, general manager, and Russ Anderson was the service manager. They're both from Philadelphia, and they worked together so well that when Alex decided he wanted to go to start a new business in Florida, Russ followed him. And they were very, very good at starting a business and keeping it going. They were very good employers. They treated us very well. I worked there for 2 years until my path went other places. But it was interesting to me that Russ would pick up and leave. Wherever Alex was, he would pick up and leave and go with Alex to whatever venture he was doing. It spoke a lot about Russ and who he was and the trust and loyalty he had to Alex. But it also said something about Alex as the owner and the sales manager, that he was someone that you liked to work for and with. I found that interesting. We read the Beatitudes today, and I wonder who fits in today's reading. Happy are people who are hopeless because the kingdom of heaven is theirs. Happy are people who grieve because they will be made glad. Happy are people who are humble because they will inherit the earth. Happy are people who are hungry and thirsty for righteousness because they will be fed until they're full. Happy are people who show mercy because they will receive mercy. Happy are people who have pure hearts because they will see God. And happy are people who make peace because they will be called God's children. In the story of Ruth today, who do you think fits more into that part of the Beatitudes? I know that when we talk about the story of Ruth, the main theme is Ruth. Well, the book's named after Ruth, right? She's one of the descendants, and Jesus comes through the family of Ruth, David through the line of Ruth and Boaz. We don't think much of Naomi now, do we? Well, what about Naomi? What about Naomi? She's the one who stepped out in faith with her husband and her 2 sons to go to a different land because they were starving in Judah, so they decided to go somewhere else. And they were welcomed in the land of Moab as visitors, and they were treated well. And for 10 years, she was in the land of Moab. Her husband, her 2 sons died, and she had 2 daughters-in-law. And we see from the story that Ruth is one of the 2 daughters-in-law that says, no matter what, I'm sticking with you. Through thick or thin, where you go, I will go. That's the famous lines that we like to think about and hear about loyalty and trust and love. And she could have had so much more, but she decided to stick with with Naomi. At that point, Naomi was a widow, and so was Ruth. And on the status scale, they're very, very low in status. Women alone, but as widows, they were even more. Of course, Naomi wants the best for her daughters-in-law. Marry someone, become, married again, have children, and raise your status in life and live a good life. With me, what do you have? I'm sure both women were grieving terribly. And they were clinging to each other for support and love. Naomi wanted to make sure that her daughter was well taken care of. What about Naomi? What about her that drew Ruth to her? That Ruth would forsake anything and everybody else to stick with her. It's about Ruth's loyalty and devotion, but it's about who Naomi was. And she had to be someone exceptional for Ruth to follow along her footsteps. She had to be someone of note, of worth. She goes to the land back to Judah, explains that she's bitter, very bitter because of what had happened. But in the back of her mind, she knows that she's got a steadfast companion, that she didn't really need anybody else because she had Ruth with her by her side. In the next few weeks coming up, the story will unfold with Ruth and somewhat with Naomi. But Naomi was always the one who played behind the scenes. The unspoken, the unsung hero that pushes Ruth to do more, to be more than she is, to offer her hope when sometimes Naomi didn't even have hope for herself, but yet pushed and drove and tried to make things happen for Ruth. There are many stories like this, where someone is so intriguing and so compelling that you'll follow them. We know stories like that, of people who will follow someone else because they just love working with them, just love being with them. And then wherever they'll go, I'll follow you. I knew someone who worked for one company and the head person left and went to another company, so they followed right in their footsteps just to be with them. Who else does that remind you of? When we think of the gospel story, we think of Jesus calling his disciples who had good lives. If they hadn't followed Jesus, their lives would continue probably very well. But there was something about Jesus that was so compelling, so intriguing, so inviting, that they dropped things and left and went with him. Not knowing where he was going necessarily, but trusting in this person of Jesus. Because he had something there that they just couldn't put their finger on, but it was just drawing them. Like mosquitoes up north to somebody walking in the woods. Or wood ticks jumping on your leg when you walk through the woods. You know how that is. Not saying that Jesus is a mosquito or... Now, where we'd be the mosquitoes. Anyway. But someone so compelling that the disciples would drop everything just to be with him. And endure whatever they endured to be with him. And after he died, to endure and to continue the loyalty for what he was and who he represented. That is something to be said. And we focus not so much on the disciples and what their loyalty was, but we focus on who Jesus was and what he had to offer, what compelled them, what compels us to continue the journey in our own lives, to celebrate those victories in our own lives, to be present with people, to be devoted to people, not because so much of who we are, but whose we are. The Spirit of Jesus indwelling in our hearts compels us, as it compelled the disciples, to continue on our lives, continue on our journeys, to make sense of something that is senseless, to try to figure out what's going on in this world that we can't quite explain, but yet there's got to be something more to the story. There's got to be some sort of living legacy that we continue on. People who give themselves for the betterment of other people. Not because they have to, because they want to, but because there's something else there for them to do, to complete their journeys, to complete their lives, to make their lives more full. People like that make a big impact on our lives. We think about the Brett Wiesners and others who don't have to do what they do, but they do because they want to make an impact upon people, and people follow because they know that their leader cares for them, about them. Just as Jesus cares for us and helps us continue our journeys, even though it gets really tough sometimes. And sometimes we feel like all we can do is breathe in and out, walk one step in front of the other, and not be so swallowed up in despair and hopelessness. That there is a glimmer of light in our lives that offer us something more. That there is more to our lives. That there is more to what this is all about. We celebrate the baptism of Lucille. That sparkling, genuine light that coming into our midst. The Christ candle is lit. The candles are up. The light of Christ is showing in our lives. Physically and also metaphorically in our lives. That this is who we're drawn to. This is what Jesus continues to draw us, and draw upon us, and ask of us sometimes more than we're able to give, but still, in some sense, help fill us up when there's no longer hope. But we know that there is, that there always has been for centuries and centuries, this light of Christ, this Naomi person who intrigues us and compels us, this Jesus Christ. There is more to the story because Jesus is at the center of the story. And we celebrate that because Jesus gives us hearts and minds for him.